The rain had begun before dawn, falling in thin silver threads that whispered across the crooked roof of the Whitmore cabin. Every drop seemed to carry winter's promise long before the season itself had arrived. Inside the tiny wooden home, the cold lingered in every corner, creeping through cracked walls and loose floorboards until even breathing felt heavy. A dying fire glowed faintly in the hearth, too weak to warm the room, too stubborn to surrender completely. For children lay close together beneath a single worn blanket, not because they were sleeping comfortably, but because sharing what little warmth remained was the only way to keep the youngest from shivering. Baby Noah whimpered against his mother's chest. Clara Whitmore gently rocked him, humming a lullaby her own mother had once sung, though she knew the melody could not quiet an empty stomach forever. The 10-month-old rooted weakly against her dress, searching for milk that hunger had nearly stolen from her. She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the helpless ache rising inside her, then kissed the soft curls on his forehead. "It will be better soon," she whispered, though she had no certainty left to offer. Across the room, 11-year-old Daniel was already awake. He had learned long ago that older brothers did not have the luxury of pretending everything was fine. He quietly adjusted the blanket over 7-year-old Lucy before glancing toward his mother. He noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the way she smiled only when someone was watching. He knew that smile was not real anymore. 9-year-old Samuel sat silently beside the cold fireplace, studying the empty iron cooking pot hanging above dead ashes. He never asked when breakfast would come. Questions only made silence hurt more. Lucy stirred awake and immediately looked toward the wooden shelf where bread usually rested. The shelf was empty. She looked away before anyone noticed. No one spoke the truth aloud. For 2 days the Whitmore family had eaten nothing. Not because Thomas refused to work. Not because Clara lacked courage. But because the previous storm had destroyed half the nearby forest roads, leaving honest men without work and honest families without food. Thomas Whitmore quietly laced his weathered boots beside the door. Though only 29, hardship had carved maturity into every line of his face. His broad shoulders carried years of labor, yet kindness still softened his eyes. Throughout the valley he was known as the woodcutter who never charged widows for firewood, never ignored a hungry traveler, and never allowed an elderly neighbor to carry heavy bundles alone. Many had benefited from his generosity. Few realized generosity often came at the expense of his own family. He reached into the cupboard one final time. Nothing. Only an empty cloth sack. He closed the door gently so the children would not hear its hollow sound. Clara approached him, still cradling Noah. "You don't have to go in this weather." He smiled, though worry lingered beneath it. "I do." She searched his face. "There isn't much left in the royal forest. There are always fallen branches after a storm." She lowered her voice. "If the guards mistake you for stealing, they know me." His confidence sounded stronger than he felt. Thomas cupped her cheek with rough hands scarred by years of swinging an axe. "I won't touch a living tree." She leaned into his touch. "I know." Daniel quietly stood. "I'll come with you." Thomas immediately shook his head. "You stay here. I can help carry wood." "You'll help more by protecting your brother and sister." Daniel wanted to argue. Instead he nodded. Thomas placed one hand firmly on the boy's shoulder. "You are the man of this house whenever I'm away." The words filled Daniel with pride and fear all at once. Thomas crossed the room. He kissed Samuel's forehead. "My clever boy." Then Lucy's. "My sunshine." Finally he tickled baby Noah's tiny fingers until the infant managed the faintest smile despite his hunger. Thomas looked toward Clara once more. She already knew what he wanted to say. He stepped closer anyway. "Tonight." His voice remained steady. "We'll have bread." For the first time in days, hope flickered inside the little cabin. Even Lucy smiled. Thomas pulled on his worn coat, lifted his axe, and disappeared into the gray morning rain. Clara stood in the doorway watching until the mist swallowed him completely. Far beyond the valley, another morning unfolded very differently. Dozens of horses stamped impatiently outside Ashcombe Castle while liveried servants tightened saddles and polished rifles. Huntsmen prepared hounds. Noble guests laughed beneath expensive cloaks, eager for sport. At the center of them all stood Duke Adrian Ashcombe. 35 years old, broad-shouldered and commanding, Adrian possessed the calm confidence of a man accustomed to impossible responsibilities. Though celebrated across the kingdom as its greatest hunter, he found little joy in killing. Today's hunt served necessity more than entertainment. A massive stag had destroyed crops, trampled fences, and left desperate farmers pleading for help. Adrian mounted his horse. No reckless shots, he instructed quietly. His men nodded. The stag comes first. No innocent life is worth a trophy. The hunting party entered the forest beneath dark clouds. Hours passed. Rain deepened. Thomas carefully gathered fallen branches exactly as the law allowed, bundling each piece with practiced hands. The growing pile remained pitifully small, but it would earn enough coins for bread if he could carry it home. He paused. Somewhere ahead came crashing branches. Then another. Birds exploded upward from the trees. Thomas frowned. The enormous stag burst into view, eyes wild with terror. It thundered between ancient oaks, fleeing unseen danger. Behind it came riders. One frightened servant accidentally urged his horse too close. The startled stag swerved sharply. Adrian reacted instantly. He drew his bow. One smooth motion. One careful breath. One arrow flew through the rain. For the briefest heartbeat, everything became silent. The stag leaped aside. The arrow vanished beyond it. A dull impact echoed through the forest. Then came the sound no hunter ever wished to hear. A man collapsing. Adrian's blood turned cold. He spurred his horse forward. Thomas lay against a fallen oak, the arrow buried deep in his chest. His bundle of firewood had scattered across the wet earth, mixing with rain-soaked leaves. Blood slowly spread through his worn shirt while his axe rested harmlessly beside his outstretched hand. "No," Adrian whispered. He dropped to his knees. "Doctor," he shouted. "Now." Servants raced in every direction as the Duke pressed trembling hands against the wound, refusing to surrender the stranger to fate. Thomas struggled for each breath. His eyes found Adrian's. There was confusion. Then astonishing calm. "My family." "We'll save you," Adrian said desperately. "You mustn't speak." Thomas managed the faintest shake of his head. "My wife." His lips trembled. "My children." The Duke leaned closer, rain dripping from his dark hair. "Tell me." With the last strength remaining inside him, Thomas whispered words that would follow Adrian for the rest of his life. "Please, don't let my children starve." His body relaxed. The forest became unbearably still. The physician arrived moments later, but one glance was enough. He quietly removed his hat. The Duke remained kneeling beside the lifeless woodcutter, unable to move, unable to breathe past the crushing weight settling over his heart. Then, through the curtain of rain, distant voices drifted between the trees. A young boy calling for his father, a little girl answering, and a mother's trembling voice carrying a baby toward the place where hope had just died. Rain continued to fall as though the heavens themselves refused to believe Thomas Whitmore was gone. The forest that had echoed with birdsong only hours earlier now carried nothing except muffled sobs and the slow creak of the cart bearing his body home. Clara walked beside it without speaking, baby Noah asleep against her shoulder from sheer exhaustion rather than comfort. Daniel gripped one side of the cart with trembling hands, refusing to let strangers carry his father alone. Samuel followed with lowered eyes, memorizing every muddy footprint as though understanding the road might somehow undo the tragedy. Little Lucy held tightly to her mother's skirt, frightened that if she let go, someone else she loved would disappear forever. The villagers stepped aside as the procession entered the settlement. Some removed their hats. Others quietly bowed their heads. Thomas had spent years helping neighbors repair fences, split firewood, and rescue stranded livestock without ever expecting payment. Even those who possessed little had always found something generous in him. Their sorrow was genuine. Yet sorrow rarely silenced greed. Thomas's elder brother, Edward Whitmore, waited outside the family farmhouse with folded arms and cold eyes. Beside him stood their aging mother, Margaret, her grief already twisting into bitterness. Several relatives clustered behind them, whispering among themselves before the cart had even stopped. Edward looked first at his brother's body, then at Clara. His expression hardened. "You should never have let him leave." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "He left to feed his children." "He left because you couldn't manage your own household." The accusation struck harder than the rain. Daniel stepped forward immediately. "Don't speak to mother like that." Edward glared at the boy. "The adults are talking." "They're lying," Daniel answered. Samuel quietly caught his brother's sleeve before anger carried him too far. Inside the humble church, the funeral passed beneath gray light filtering through rain-speckled windows. The village priest spoke of Thomas's kindness, honesty, and quiet courage. Men who had once worked beside him wiped tears from weathered faces. Women remembered baskets of chopped firewood mysteriously appearing outside their doors during harsh winters. Clara listened without moving. She scarcely heard the prayers. Every heartbeat still expected Thomas to smile, apologize for frightening everyone, and walk through the chapel doors carrying fresh bread. Instead, the coffin remained still. Lucy laid a tiny wildflower upon it. "I found this yesterday," she whispered softly. "I was saving it for Papa." No one answered. When the burial ended, villagers slowly returned to their homes, carrying sorrow with them. The Whitmore relatives remained. Edward waited until the last mourners disappeared beyond the churchyard before speaking again. "This house belongs to Father's blood." Clara frowned. It was Thomas's home. And Thomas is dead. The words echoed with merciless finality. Margaret stepped closer. "My son worked himself into an early grave because of you." Clara's eyes widened. "I begged him not to go into the storm. You should have gone instead." Silence swept across the yard. Lucy burst into frightened tears. Baby Noah awoke crying. Daniel clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Samuel simply stared at the ground as though refusing to witness adults becoming crueler than children. Edward pointed toward the road. "You have no place here anymore." Clara looked from one familiar face to another. None defended her. One cousin carried their blankets outside and dropped them into the mud. Another tossed Clara's small sewing basket after them. Their cooking pot followed. Then their spare clothing. Even baby Noah's wooden cradle was dragged outside and overturned onto the wet ground. Lucy ran toward it. "That's Noah's bed." Margaret snatched the tiny blanket from the cradle. "My grandson's belongings stay with his family." Daniel stepped between his grandmother and his siblings. "We are his family." Edward shoved the boy backward. "You belong nowhere." Clara immediately caught Daniel before he fell. She lifted her eyes, not with anger but quiet heartbreak. "Please." It was the first time she had begged for anything. "Leave the children out of this." Margaret's face remained unmoved. "If you wanted mercy, you should have found another husband before my son died." Several villagers overheard. Some looked horrified. Others lowered their eyes in uncomfortable silence. No one intervened. Within minutes, the door of the farmhouse slammed shut. The bolt slid into place. Clara stood outside with 4 children, one bundle of soaked clothing and nowhere left to go. Rain soaked their hair. Mud swallowed their worn boots. Daniel gathered the scattered blankets despite knowing they were already drenched. Samuel carefully rescued Noah's cradle, repairing its broken side with a strip of leather from his own boot. Lucy silently hugged the cracked wooden frame. Baby Noah cried harder from hunger. Clara sat beside the road because her legs would no longer hold her. She wrapped all 4 children beneath the wet blanket as best she could, shielding Noah beneath her dress. Hours passed. The rain never stopped. Travelers passed without slowing. Carriages rolled through muddy puddles. Windows remained closed. The kingdom moved on. Daniel whispered, "Mother, where will we sleep?" Clara looked toward the darkening sky. "I don't know." Samuel quietly removed the small piece of bread he had hidden for 2 days. It had grown hard as stone. He broke it into 4 tiny pieces. One for Daniel. One for Lucy. One softened with rainwater for Noah. The last he placed into Clara's hand. She smiled gently. "You eat it." "I'm not hungry." She recognized the lie immediately. She slipped the piece back into his pocket. "You are." The boy lowered his head without arguing. Lucy leaned against Clara's shoulder. "Everyone's gone." Clara stared across the empty road where neighbors once smiled at Thomas. Her voice trembled so softly it nearly disappeared beneath the rain. "Everyone left us after my husband died." Hidden beneath the shelter of towering oaks beyond the road, Duke Adrian Ashcombe had witnessed every moment. He had followed from the funeral, unable to silence the promise Thomas had whispered with his final breath. Every insult hurled at Clara felt like another arrow striking his own conscience. Every tear from the children deepened the burden already crushing his heart. When Edward shoved Daniel, Adrian's hands instinctively tightened. When baby Noah cried from hunger, guilt became unbearable. He removed his riding gloves. Slowly, deliberately, he walked through the rain toward the abandoned family. The children looked up first. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of his mother. Samuel studied the stranger's noble clothing with cautious eyes. Lucy clung tighter to Clara. Adrian stopped several feet away. Instead of standing above them, he lowered himself onto one knee in the mud until he met Clara's eyes as an equal rather than a ruler. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain dripped from his dark hair onto the soaked earth between them. Finally Clara whispered the same broken sentence once more. "Everyone left us after my husband died." Adrian looked at each child in turn before answering with a calmness forged from unbearable remorse. "They won't hurt you again." His voice grew steadier. "I'll break the hands that hurt you again." The promise settled into the rain-soaked silence like an oath before heaven itself. Then the Duke extended his hand toward the widow whose husband had died by his arrow, unaware that accepting it would carry both of them into a castle where enemies were already preparing a far deadlier hunt. The towering gates of Ashcombe Castle opened with the deep groan of ancient iron, revealing a world that seemed impossibly distant from the muddy roadside where Clara and her children had nearly spent the night. Warm lanterns glowed beneath stone archways. Marble fountains shimmered despite the rain. Well-fed horses stood beneath polished stables while servants hurried beneath covered walkways carrying silver trays and fresh flowers. It was a place built for abundance, yet as Clara stepped across the threshold holding baby Noah, she felt poorer than ever. Every pair of eyes followed them. The servants did not hide their curiosity. Some whispered. Others openly stared at the widow whose soaked dress still clung to her from the storm. Daniel instinctively moved closer to his mother. Samuel quietly counted every unfamiliar face, memorizing those who frowned. Lucy looked upward in silent wonder at ceilings painted with angels she had never imagined could exist. Baby Noah had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder, exhausted after crying himself into silence. Duke Adrian walked several steps ahead, his expression calm but unreadable. "Prepare the east guest wing," he instructed. A middle-aged woman in an immaculate black dress bowed stiffly. "As your grace commands." Her name was Martha. She served as the castle's chief housekeeper. Behind lowered eyes hid a calculating mind already judging every member of the Whitmore family. As the servants dispersed, Martha quietly slipped away through another corridor. Minutes later she entered an elegant sitting room where Lord Victor Ashcombe poured himself a glass of wine. The Duke's older cousin looked up before she even spoke. "They're here?" Martha nodded. "A widow? Children?" "4." Victor smiled without warmth. "So, Adrian has finally brought his weakness home." Across the room, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe slowly closed the novel resting in her lap. "A poor woodcutter's widow?" Martha inclined her head. "Worse." Beatrice's lips curled. "My brother cannot possibly be considering charity on this scale." Victor swirled the wine inside his crystal glass. "Charity becomes affection." His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Affection becomes marriage." The room fell silent. Then Victor quietly added, "If that woman becomes Duchess, everything I have waited for disappears." Back in the guest wing, servants placed warm blankets upon clean beds. Fresh bread filled the room with an aroma so rich that Lucy stared as though afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Daniel hesitated before reaching for a loaf. Clara gently nodded. "You may." He carefully broke it into equal pieces. One for Samuel. One for Lucy. One softened and warm milk for Noah. Only after every sibling had food did Daniel take the final piece. Adrian noticed. He said nothing. Yet something inside him shifted. Most children who had starved would have eaten first. Daniel had chosen everyone else before himself. Later that evening, Clara quietly thanked the kitchen staff for the meal. Several servants ignored her completely. Others exchanged amused glances. One young maid whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I didn't know beggars curtsied." Laughter followed. Clara simply lowered her eyes. "Thank you for feeding my children." She walked away before pride could answer cruelty. The following morning revealed that the castle possessed far colder corners than its stone walls. Daniel wandered into the courtyard while searching for water. A silver pocket watch suddenly disappeared from a visiting nobleman's coat. Within moments, accusing fingers pointed toward the poor woodcutter's son. He was standing closest. "I saw him looking at it." "He stole it." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't." No one listened. A guard searched his pockets. Nothing. Another searched his boots. Still nothing. Only when the nobleman discovered the watch beneath his own carriage seat did the accusations quietly end. No apology followed. Daniel returned to his room carrying humiliation heavier than any bundle of firewood. Meanwhile Samuel attempted to help inside the stables. The stable boys mocked his patched clothing before shoving him into muddy straw. When he calmly stood again, another punch struck his shoulder. "You don't belong here." Samuel refused to fight back. He simply carried bruises home instead. Lucy suffered differently. The daughters of visiting nobles laughed at her faded dress and worn shoes. One little girl deliberately stepped on Lucy's handmade cloth doll until its stitching split apart. Lucy repaired it herself that evening with needle and thread while pretending tears belonged only to the rain outside. Baby Noah soon developed a fever. Night after night Clara remained awake beside his bed, cooling his forehead with damp cloths. She never asked anyone for help. Instead, she quietly thanked every servant who brought fresh water. Weeks passed. Despite endless insults, Clara answered bitterness with kindness. She noticed torn uniforms hanging in the servants' quarters and silently repaired them after everyone slept. She prepared warm soup whenever workers returned exhausted from repairing storm damage. She baked simple honey cakes using forgotten family recipes that filled the castle with comforting memories. Old gardeners found fresh bandages waiting after long days among thorn bushes. Village children began gathering outside the kitchen because the gentle widow taught them letters while bread cooled in the ovens. Slowly, smiles replaced suspicious glances. One servant after another discovered that Clara remembered every name. She thanked everyone personally. She never behaved as though hardship entitled her to pity. Even Martha struggled to find genuine faults worth reporting. Duke Adrian often watched unseen from distant hallways. He saw Daniel helping elderly servants carry firewood without being asked. He saw Samuel repairing broken toys for younger children. He saw Lucy sharing slices of cake with stable cats before tasting any herself. The castle, once filled with polished silence, slowly echoed with laughter again. For the first time in years, Adrian found himself lingering near the nursery simply to hear Noah giggle. Then autumn arrived. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Ashcombe decided to visit a nearby monastery despite warnings of hungry wolves roaming the forests after failed hunting seasons. Her carriage departed with armed guards. Clara watched it disappear beyond the gates. An hour later, frantic riders burst back toward the castle. Wolves! The Dowager Duchess! Help! Before anyone organized a rescue, Clara seized 2 burning branches from the courtyard forge. Daniel grabbed another. Samuel carried a heavy shovel. Ignoring every shouted warning, they ran toward the forest. They found overturned horses, terrified guards, a circle of starving wolves closing around the elderly duchess. Without hesitation, Clara rushed between them. She swung blazing branches in wide circles, driving back snapping jaws with fearless determination. Daniel shouted at the wolves while striking tree trunks. Samuel hurled stones with astonishing accuracy. The pack finally retreated into the shadows. The Duchess collapsed safely into Clara's arms. Hours later, Eleanor sat wrapped in blankets beside the castle fireplace. She reached trembling fingers toward Clara's hand. "My child." Clara smiled softly. "I'm only grateful you're safe." The elderly Duchess's eyes filled with tears. "No." She squeezed Clara's hand with surprising strength. "From this day onward, you are my daughter." Standing unnoticed beyond the doorway, Duke Adrian watched the scene in silence, his heart surrendering completely to the woman who had risked her life for his mother, while somewhere deeper within the castle, Lord Victor quietly folded a fresh sheet of parchment and whispered, "If kindness cannot destroy her, then lies certainly will." Autumn surrendered to early winter, and the warmth Clara Whitmore had quietly breathed into Ashcombe Castle began to feel like something fragile, as though happiness itself sensed danger approaching. The servants smiled more readily because of her. The kitchens echoed with laughter again. The village children proudly carried books she had taught them to read. Daniel had become a trusted helper in the workshops. Samuel spent evenings repairing broken lanterns for stable hands. Lucy filled empty corners with songs that reminded weary workers of home, and baby Noah no longer cried himself to sleep from hunger. Yet every peaceful day tightened the knot of fear inside Lord Victor Ashcombe. He watched Duke Adrian from a balcony overlooking the gardens. The Duke no longer walked alone. Whenever official duties allowed, he found reasons to pass through the kitchens, the schoolroom, or the courtyard where Clara worked beside the children. His stern expression softened whenever Noah reached toward him with tiny hands. He listened patiently to Samuel's thoughtful questions. He praised Daniel's growing strength. He laughed when Lucy crowned him with daisies gathered from the castle grounds. Victor needed no confession to recognize love. Love threatened everything he had planned for years. Late one evening he summoned Martha to a forgotten chamber beneath the western tower. A single lantern illuminated the room while rain tapped softly against narrow windows. "You've watched her carefully," Victor said. "I have." "Any weaknesses?" Martha hesitated. "None worth using." Victor frowned. "Everyone has one. She tells the truth. Then we'll give her lies instead." Lady Beatrice arrived moments later, elegantly dressed despite the secrecy of the meeting. Her expression carried the same cold resentment she had worn since Clara first crossed the castle gates. "I refuse to watch father's fortune pass to a woodcutter's widow," she declared. Victor smiled faintly. "It won't." He spread several blank sheets of expensive parchment across the table. "People rarely believe goodness." His fingers rested upon the untouched paper. "They always believe evidence." Over the following weeks the conspiracy unfolded with patient precision. Martha quietly obtained impressions of the Duke's official seal. Victor hired a skilled forger from another county, paying generously for flawless handwriting. Beatrice began whispering carefully chosen rumors during noble dinners. She never accused Clara directly. Instead she sighed sadly and asked innocent questions. "Isn't it remarkable how quickly some people become comfortable inside castles? I wonder whether poverty teaches gratitude or ambition." Each conversation planted another seed of suspicion. Soon whispers spread beyond the castle walls. Martha waited until Clara accompanied Eleanor to distribute winter blankets among poor villagers. During those hours she entered the guest chambers. A velvet pouch filled with stolen emerald jewelry disappeared beneath loose floorboards beneath Clara's bed. Forged letters appeared inside her sewing basket, suggesting secret correspondence with unknown buyers seeking maps of royal estates and copies of confidential documents. Nothing looked rushed. Everything appeared authentic. Even the dust settled naturally before anyone returned. Days later the trap tightened. A treasury clerk announced missing jewels. Castle guards searched every occupied room. Clara welcomed them without protest. "I have nothing to hide." Daniel stood beside his mother. "So do it quickly." The captain lifted the loose floorboard. His face changed instantly. The emerald necklace sparkled in the candlelight. Silence swept through the room. Lucy stared without understanding. Samuel looked from the jewels to his mother's bewildered expression. "No," Clara whispered. "I've never seen those." Another guard opened her sewing basket. Inside rested folded letters sealed with wax. The captain broke one open. His eyes widened. The letter described payments for information supposedly stolen from Ashcombe Castle. Every signature matched Clara's name. Every sentence sounded convincing. Daniel stepped forward. "They're fake." The captain lowered his eyes. "I wish I believed that." Word spread through the castle within minutes. Servants who had once defended Clara suddenly avoided meeting her gaze. Some believed the accusations. Others simply feared standing beside someone under suspicion. The corridors that had finally begun feeling like home became painfully unfamiliar again. Dowager Duchess Eleanor refused to accept the evidence. She marched directly into Adrian's study carrying the forged letters. "Someone has framed her." Adrian slowly examined every page. "I want to believe that." "Then do." He closed his eyes briefly. "The seal is genuine. It was copied. The handwriting matches. It was forged. The jewels were found beneath her bed." Eleanor's voice broke. "You know her." "I do." "Then trust what you know." Adrian remained silent. The terrible weight of responsibility settled upon his shoulders. As Duke, he could not ignore evidence simply because his heart objected. As a man, he could scarcely breathe beneath what that evidence demanded. That evening he requested Clara meet him in the library. Rain struck the tall windows while the fireplace burned quietly between them. Neither sat. Neither wished to. Clara already understood why she had been summoned. Adrian held the letters but never looked at them. Instead he looked at her. "I searched for another explanation." She answered softly. "So did I. I found none." "I know." Pain filled the silence. Finally he forced himself to speak. "Until this investigation ends, you cannot remain here." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "My mother didn't do anything." Samuel quietly placed a hand upon his brother's arm. Clara never looked away from Adrian. "Do you believe I betrayed you?" The question pierced him more deeply than any blade. "I." His voice failed. He could not say yes. He could not say no. Duty chained every word. Clara understood before he answered. A faint, heartbreaking smile touched her lips. "I've learned not to force people to believe me." She bowed respectfully. "Thank you for protecting my children while you could." Then she turned away. No accusation. No anger. No plea. Only quiet dignity. Before sunrise the next morning, Clara packed the few belongings that truly belonged to them. Daniel carried Noah's cradle. Samuel wrapped their blankets. Lucy carefully tucked her repaired cloth doll beneath one arm. Many servants watched from hidden windows. Several cried. None dared intervene. Dowager Duchess Eleanor embraced Clara fiercely. "This is not your home leaving you." Clara gently kissed the older woman's cheek. "I know. It is evil entering it." Unable to watch another moment, Eleanor turned away in tears. The castle gates closed behind the departing family with a sound that echoed through Adrian's soul. He stood alone behind the highest window of the western tower, watching them become smaller beneath gathering snow until they disappeared beyond the hills. Only after they vanished did he allow himself to lean against the cold stone wall. For the first time since Thomas Whitmore's death, Adrian felt completely powerless. Winter greeted the Whitmores without mercy. They found shelter inside a ruined cottage abandoned years earlier. Half the roof had collapsed. Wind slipped through broken walls. Rain collected inside cracked wooden buckets because the ceiling no longer kept storms outside. Daniel hauled water for neighboring farms in exchange for scraps of bread. Samuel repaired broken handles, cracked stools, and rusted tools for pennies. Lucy wandered frozen fields gathering herbs villagers overlooked. Clara quietly accepted sewing whenever anyone offered work. Each evening she divided every meal into 5 portions. She always claimed she had already eaten. The children believed her. Her stomach remained empty night after night. Baby Noah slowly regained strength because every crumb Clara denied herself became nourishment for him instead. Far away, Dowager Duchess Eleanor refused to surrender. Disguised beneath an ordinary traveling cloak, she secretly followed the family whenever she could, leaving sacks of flour, bundles of firewood, and jars of preserves outside the cottage before dawn. She never allowed herself to be seen. One snowy evening she arrived later than usual. Through a broken window she witnessed Clara place the last bowl of soup before her children. Daniel insisted she eat. She smiled and shook her head. "I'm full." Only after every child finished did Clara quietly collapse onto the rough wooden floor, unconscious from exhaustion and hunger. Eleanor covered her mouth to silence a cry. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried back toward Ashcombe Castle through the falling snow. She burst into Adrian's study without waiting for permission, her face white with grief. Looking directly into her son's eyes, she spoke a single sentence that shattered every certainty he still possessed. "The woman who saved my life is dying while your enemies drink your wine." Spring arrived quietly, carrying warmth back into the valley one hesitant sunrise at a time, but inside Ashcombe Castle, Duke Adrian Ashcombe found no comfort in brighter skies. Dowager Duchess Eleanor's words echoed through every sleepless night until they became impossible to silence. "The woman who saved my life is dying while your enemies drink your wine." Adrian no longer trusted his own conclusions. He trusted the evidence even less. If Clara Whitmore truly possessed the heart he believed she did, then somewhere the truth had been buried beneath carefully arranged lies. He summoned no counsel. He informed no one. For the first time since inheriting the duchy, he investigated not as a ruler surrounded by advisors, but as a hunter following a wounded trail. Every forged letter returned to his desk. Every servant involved in the search was questioned again. Every timeline was rebuilt hour by hour. Most answers matched. One did not. Martha claimed she had remained in the laundry rooms while Clara visited the village with the Dowager Duchess. Yet an elderly maid quietly admitted seeing Martha leave the guest wing carrying an empty velvet pouch that same afternoon. She had remained silent before because she feared losing her position. Now, seeing the Duke's determination, her conscience became stronger than her fear. Adrian immediately ordered the guest chambers sealed. He searched every room himself. Behind the great fireplace inside the unused servants' corridor, something caught his attention. A tiny fragment of crimson wax rested inside a crack in the stone. It bore only half an impression. Not enough to identify. Not enough to ignore. At that moment Samuel's quiet voice returned to his memory. Weeks before leaving the castle, the thoughtful boy had once mentioned discovering a strange broken seal near the old fireplace. Adrian had dismissed it as childish curiosity. Now he realized it might have been the missing piece. He rode immediately toward the ruined cottage. The journey felt longer than any campaign he had ever fought. Snow still lingered beneath ancient trees despite the warming air. When the broken cottage finally appeared beyond the hills, guilt struck him harder than the winter wind. Half the roof sagged beneath patched timber. Smoke barely escaped the crooked chimney. The once proud family lived inside little more than a shelter against death. Samuel answered the door. For a moment surprise crossed the boy's face. Then caution replaced it. "You came. I need your help." Without bitterness, Samuel disappeared inside and returned carrying a small cloth bundle. "I kept it because it looked important." Inside rested the missing fragment of crimson sealing wax. When Adrian placed it beside the piece found inside the castle, they fit together perfectly. The complete impression revealed the unmistakable crest of Lord Victor Ashcombe. Everything suddenly aligned. The forged letters, the hidden jewels, the copied seals, the whispers, the accusations, the trap. Adrian's face hardened with a resolve none of his enemies had ever witnessed. The hunt had finally found its prey. Within days the great hall filled with nobles, magistrates, village elders, servants, and guards. Lord Victor stood confidently beside Lady Beatrice and Martha, believing another routine inquiry would soon clear every accusation. Instead, Adrian entered carrying both halves of the broken seal. The hall fell silent. Without raising his voice, the Duke presented every discovery. The elderly maid testified. The royal forger, captured while attempting to flee the kingdom, confessed to copying Clara's handwriting for a generous payment. Stable records proved Martha had lied about her whereabouts. The treasury clerk admitted Victor had insisted the jewels be counted only after Clara returned from the village. One witness followed another. Every lie unraveled. Every thread of deceit led back to Victor. Beatrice's composure finally shattered. It was supposed to protect our family. Our family? Adrian asked quietly. You nearly destroyed an innocent one. Victor laughed bitterly. Innocent? He stepped forward. Everything belongs to Ashcombe blood. It belongs to justice, Adrian answered. Victor's confidence collapsed when Martha suddenly fell to her knees. I planted the jewels. Tears streamed down her face. I forged nothing, but I hid everything exactly where Lord Victor ordered. Gasps swept through the crowded hall. Victor realized the game had ended. He closed his eyes. I would have inherited everything if she had disappeared. The confession echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. Adrian looked across the gathered crowd. No title gives permission to destroy the innocent. His judgment carried the authority of generations. Lord Victor Ashcombe is stripped of every title, estate, privilege, and claim. Victor lowered his head. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe is removed from succession and permanently exiled. She burst into furious protest, but guards stepped forward before another word escaped. Martha, having confessed willingly, will spend the remainder of her life serving the orphan houses she helped create through her lies. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Yet Adrian knew one duty remained greater than all the others. Before sunset he saddled his horse alone. Dark clouds gathered overhead as another storm rolled across the countryside. Rain began falling halfway to Clara's cottage. It felt strangely familiar. When he reached the weathered doorway, Clara was hanging freshly washed clothes despite the approaching rain. She looked thinner than he remembered. Her hands bore fresh scars from endless work. Yet kindness still lived within her eyes. She saw the Duke approaching and quietly lowered the basket. I thought the investigation had ended. It has. She nodded gently. I hope you found what you were looking for. I found the truth. Daniel and Samuel stepped outside. Lucy stood behind them holding Noah, now laughing happily despite the drizzle. Adrian removed neither his gloves nor his riding coat. Instead he slowly dropped to one knee upon the wet earth. The same place where months earlier he had promised protection. Only this time his head bowed lower. I have already asked forgiveness for believing lies. Clara remained silent. There is another truth. His voice trembled for the first time. The hardest one. Rain soaked his shoulders. I was hunting the day Thomas died. Daniel's breathing stopped. Samuel stared without blinking. Lucy's smile vanished. Adrian forced himself to continue. The arrow that struck your husband. He closed his eyes. Was mine. Silence swallowed the world. Only rain remained. Clara's fingers loosened around the basket until it slipped into the mud. For one unbearable moment every memory returned. Thomas's promise. The forest. The coffin. The roadside. The castle. The growing love she had tried so desperately not to feel. Tears finally escaped her eyes. You knew. I knew from the beginning. You carried this alone. I deserved to. I feared if I spoke too soon, grief would steal your chance to survive. His voice broke. I tried to honor his final wish because I could never return his life. He slowly rose. I don't deserve forgiveness. He turned toward his horse. I only wanted you to know the truth before I disappeared from your life forever. No one moved. Then Daniel stepped forward. I remember. Everyone looked at the 11-year-old. When father was dying. His voice shook. He smiled. He wasn't smiling because he wasn't hurt. He smiled because someone promised to help us. Samuel quietly added, Father didn't ask for revenge. He asked that we wouldn't starve. Lucy hugged Noah closer. And you kept that promise. Clara looked from her children to the man standing alone in the rain. She finally understood why he had watched them with such unbearable sorrow. Why he had knelt instead of commanded. Why every kindness carried the weight of guilt. Thomas had died because of a tragic accident. But Adrian had chosen truth over comfort, justice over reputation, and sacrifice over silence. She walked toward him slowly. He did not lift his eyes. Instead, she gently took his trembling hands into hers. I cannot change yesterday. Neither can you. But every day since then. She smiled through tears. You have been trying to keep one dying man's last promise. Adrian finally looked up. She nodded once. I forgive you. Months later the royal gardens overflowed with blooming white roses. The kingdom gathered not for judgment, but for celebration. Dowager Duchess Eleanor walked proudly with baby Noah in her arms, calling him her grandson without hesitation. Daniel carried the wedding rings with quiet dignity. Samuel stood beside Adrian as proudly as any noble heir. Lucy scattered white petals across the garden path while laughing freely for the first time since her father's death. Before nobles and villagers alike, Duke Adrian knelt before Clara one final time. Not from guilt, not from grief, but from love. Will you let me spend the rest of my life keeping the promise I made in the rain? Clara reached for his hands, the same hands that had once carried unbearable regret and now offered unwavering devotion. With joyful tears shining in her eyes, she answered softly, I will. As the bells of Ashcombe rang across the valley, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, and somewhere beyond earthly sight, it seemed as though Thomas Whitmore's final prayer had been answered at last. His children would never know hunger again, his widow had found a love built upon truth rather than perfection, and a promise whispered beneath dying breath had become the foundation of a family that would endure for generations.